Hey everybody, again, this is Baker's Backyard or Baker's Corner. Hope you all are doing well. This is going to be our second lesson of week 2. We're moving right along into our presidency, actually into our third president, which is President Thomas Jefferson. For those of you that are looking ahead to week 3, this is kind of a neat lesson because we actually transition to his good friend or good buddy. Some people would even use the saying of James Madison with the famous War of 1812. And then also the James Monroe presidency, which will be President 5. Consequently, kind of a fun fact here, all three of these gentlemen are going to be Virginians. And actually, out of the first 5 presidents, 4 out of our 5 have been Virginians, right? So there's a very strong influence of Virginians, right? I don't know if any of you watching or in my class have Virginia roots with your family, but it's kind of something interesting to think about. So let's get into the age of Jefferson's presidency. So we want to think about where we left off last time. So the review of last time is that you've got this presidency in John Adams, right? The last Federalist, of course, after the election of Jefferson in 1800. And so you've got this big, I guess, rivalry, you could say, in some ways, that consequently continues in some ways, literally until the day that both of them died. Both the gentlemen, if you didn't know this, died July 4th. Of the year 1826. And Abigail Adams was very adamant about trying to, I guess, make some degree of peace or whatever between the two. But in this election, this is not going to be an outcome that Adams is going to be just accepting with really the most open arms. All right, so we'll talk about that in a second. But how does the election of 1800, how did it represent a major turning point in American political history? Okay. At this point, students, you should be thinking about turning points, right? Significant events or whatever it might be that kind of changes the course of history, possibly for the better, possibly for the worse, perhaps, right? But anyway, you want to be thinking about that. The next thing we want to do, this is actually kind of like related to one of the outcomes of the election, or at least moving forward, is we want to be able to define a very important constitutional concept of judicial review, and not just, oh, it happened, but really be able to define it. It's a lot like the importance of really knowing the definition of nullification from the previous lesson and being able to apply it to why it's significant. Next thing, explain the impact of the Louisiana Purchase on the social, political, and economic development of the United States. Now, the one thing I'll tell you guys is that this is an ongoing objective, that basically what we mean is that we're going to see more effects of this as we move into new states entering the union, etc. So there's a lot of ways. So we're only going to hit the tip of the iceberg here, but you'll see this as we move forward. Because remember, the Louisiana Purchase was a huge piece of land, right? And then lastly, something for you all to individually put your interpretation and your historical thinking into place. You want to be able to think about evaluating the legacy of the Adams and Jefferson administrations. So what is their place in history, right? If you were going to write a book on ranking presidents or looking at their, effectiveness or whatever, what would be something that you think could be, maybe a feather in the cap of Adams and a feather in the cap of Jefferson. And both of them guys, I mean, they're humans, right? So, even though Washington was considered by many or some to be an untouchable American, you just don't openly criticize the guy very often. There were some things that, again, you can evaluate. So let's get started. Okay, so the outcome of the election of 1800, if you remember from last time, we said for the most part that this is going to be an election where Adams, guys, remember, does run for re-election and unsuccessfully does not get the presidency for another term. Okay. And so you've got this packed house of candidates, like many of the elections back then were. And you got to remember, I mean, the person that wins the highest number of electoral votes, if it's the majority they need, becomes the president. And of course, the next in line becomes the vice president, right? Which is why you had Jefferson as the VP in the 1796 election. Okay. And so at the end of the day, the votes are cast. There's not the number of electoral votes that they need or that one candidate needs. And so the Constitution, I think, is pretty clear on this. We then send the election to the House of what? Representatives. And in that particular vote, every state has one vote. And they basically decided to throw the election to Jefferson. Now, this is one out of several times that this happens in American history. The next time will be the famous corrupt bargain of 1824, where we see Andrew Jackson, who was probably snubbed, to be honest, for his election, but nonetheless, he makes a great comeback in 1828 and 1832. Jefferson is going to be elected through the House, and he's basically going to have the oath of office. He makes probably one of the most impactful first inaugurals, that is, in the history of the United States presidency, where he makes the famous statement, "We are all Federalists, we are all Republicans." Now, whether or not that's just him being political or whether he's being whole about that, at the end of the day, he's identifying one big thing, and that is, I think it's safe to say at this point that political parties are here to stay, and therefore, we're going to have to work together. But a lot of you are thinking, well, why does he call this the Revolution of 1800? And part of the reason for that, guys, is that we're transitioning political power to a different political party in the presidency for the first time in American history, right? So this is where we see the transition from Federalist power in the executive branch to a transition to Jefferson. Now, you might say, okay, well, Mr. Baker, why do we have a 12th Amendment here? This is something to at least be aware of, but they decided that there needed to be some change to the Electoral College, right? It used to be before this amendment that you would cast, two votes, and the person that basically had the most became president. The person that that had the second most became vice president. With this, you're casting a vote. With this amendment, the 12th, you're then casting a vote for president and a separate one for vice president. Okay, so it's going to become a lot more common moving forward that you have campaigns that are going to be based around not just platforms, but especially tickets, right? And formally telling the American people, this is who my VP is going to be on my ticket. All right, think about, are there more advantages to having a ticket like that? Or, do you think there was more better with basically having the original way that they did it? Okay, but nonetheless, that's why the Constitution was amended. And so we'll move forward. Just a quick caveat here. We will not have another amendment. This is early 1800s until the famous 13th Amendment in 1865 that basically abolishes the institution of slavery. So therefore, there's a long time coming before that amendment. So what happens? Is there a smooth transition from Adams to Jefferson? And the answer to this, guys, is no, it really isn't. Adams does not really want to concede power easily to Jefferson. And what can he do? I mean, he can pout, he can, kind of throw a hissy fit or whatever. But at the end of the day, I mean, he's got between November of 1800, and he has until March 4th of 1801 to put his mark on the presidency. He is a lame duck, right? That word you come across every so often about, somebody who's not elected or can't run again, and therefore the office is basically being kind of like paid away to the next person. Adams does some interesting things. So what can you do? Well, one thing that you can do as president is that you can have an effect on other government branches, in this case, the U.S. Supreme Court, right, which is the judicial branch. They interpret law, right? So they're going to have a lot to say about what the Constitution means, what it doesn't mean. And what he does is he basically appoints a series of, I think it was about 12 judges that we eventually called the Midnight Judges. These judges are supposed to take office as power is being transitioned from Adams to Jefferson. My question to all of you is, do any of you see any potential problems with this? And hopefully your answer is, I do. And what's the problem going to be? Well, the problem is going to be is that these men that take the office, and later on we'll have females on the court as well, keep in mind, they have life terms. in terms of good behavior is pretty much the way the Constitution states. And so these people are going to be able to interpret law, whether it's federal law, whether it's state law, whether it's actions of, the Congress, the president, whoever it might be. They get to basically be on that bench for life, unless they're impeached or something, or they die in office. They are going to hold these offices for a long time. So what brings about the issue of Marbury versus Madison? This is a court case. If I were you guys, I would stop, write it down, write down what judicial review is, and then make sure that you can explain the connection between the two. So again, remember what we said. Jefferson is going to have a really good friend in James Madison. Madison is going to be an extremely influential presence in the administration of Thomas Jefferson. He's going to hold the position of Secretary of State, obviously the same position that Jefferson held in the cabinet of Washington. And of course, Madison will go on to be the next president. All right, so you'll see that transition next week. So basically, what can Jefferson do? Well, Jefferson says to his buddy, do not basically give these men their court appointments, which in a sense means you're basically negating them from being on the court. Well, is it constitutional? We'll get to that more in a moment. So Madison, being a good friend, good buddy, whatever, follows his friend's advice and he goes, yeah, okay. And so he does that. I'm not gonna imagine that I told you, okay, I'm gonna give you a letter of recommendation, and then, I give it to someone and they're like, we're just not gonna give it to you. So we have to decide, what the law says about it. In this case, they're basically going back to the Judiciary Act of 1789. Okay. And in the case of this, and also there's a Judiciary Act of 1801, there's dialogue in those acts that the Supreme Court has to consider the constitutionality of. So a lot of people are kind of a little bit, I don't know if the right word is divided, but certainly have different modes of thinking on it. But the quick version of this, guys, is at the end of the day, when the Supreme Court hears this case, John Marshall is the head of the U.S. Supreme Court, okay, who, by the way, was a relative of Jefferson, although Jefferson is a Democratic Republican. John Marshall was in fact a Federalist. You'll see more with his court establishing federal power as we transition into the later 1800s. He, by the way, was the Chief Justice for, I think it was, over 30 years. So this guy has a very big stamp on the court, and this to a large extent is where that stamp starts. So the Supreme Court is like, okay, we can hear what Marbury is saying. Marbury is like, I deserve the position. I've been wronged. At the end of the day, the Supreme Court finds a part, not the whole thing, but a part of the Judiciary Act unconstitutional enough to basically say that, there's a problem with the act. When they do that, and this is really important, guys, to pick up on, this is where they officially establish, you could argue as a constitutional precedent or doctrine of what we call judicial review. Look at what it says. Who can rule? The U.S. Supreme Court. They can rule acts of Congress or the president or even the states unconstitutional. Okay. Now, I want you to think, guys, why is this such a big deal? Well, think about it. U.S. Supreme Court, federal level power. So they're extending a longer leash to the power of the federal government, which, of course, states' rights people are not going to be real happy about. Okay? But the second thing that's important, guys, is that they have a lot of power here to be able to say that a congressional act is unconstitutional or even a presidential act. Okay? Congressional act is a perfect example of Judiciary Act of 1789. They're telling the Congress that part of what you passed is not constitutional. They're going to justify it by examining parts of the Constitution, making, what they call court opinions. But an example of this, guys, down the line, I'm going to give you an example that's a little bit more modern, is in the case of Richard Nixon. And this is a quick example we'll come back to. But Nixon in the early 70s I think a lot of you have heard of Watergate, right? So Nixon in 74, he's, pretty much trying to justify his use of what he calls executive privilege, withholding, information from Congress in the quote unquote public good, which, by the way, Washington used that doctrine as well. Is it in the Constitution? I don't know of every single constitutional scholar that agrees on that. But what does the Supreme Court say in 74? They argued against Nixon and they ruled against him. And they said that your interpretation of this doctrine is not consistent with the Constitution. So is this a violation of checks and balances, that the court is having more power? Hopefully the court is making decisions that are bound by the Constitution as the reason for their decisions. Okay, but this is clearly an example, guys. Ever since this court case, the precedent of judicial review has been firmly established by the court. Okay, so what is going to be the basic nuts and bolts of Jefferson's ideology? His government philosophy, he's very states' rights oriented, but he does have some commitment to federal policy as well, right? Taxation policy, okay? You would think, well, man, we have this Alexander Hamilton economic plan that put new taxes into effect. Jefferson doesn't axe all of them. They do phase out, a few things, but for the most part, you're still going to have revenue to be able to make your government work. Now, I will tell you this. He does believe in smaller federal government nonetheless, in some ways. There's a case to be made that when you add millions of square miles or whatever of territory, that obviously you're adding a lot to your country is that small government. That issue does come up. But as far as the debts, he does actually, I think, create a sizable dent into the debt. Okay. Thirdly, really quick, is think about what comes to mind with this concept of common man. Okay. To Jefferson, there's a little more to it than this, just the basic nuts and bolts, guys. To Jefferson, the idea of the common man is who should drive a lot of the political power within the United States. You're looking at small farmers, a farming, what some people call an agricultural electorate or whatever. Okay, those are the ones that should have the majority of the political power. Obviously, that is going to strongly clash with the idea of a federalist like Hamilton that's like, well, no, we think that educated, more elite, people, those are the ones that should be able to have the majority of the political power. Okay, but Jefferson does sell himself as a true advocate of the common man, all right, which, by the way, is not just unique to him. Okay, so what is probably the most well-known thing of Jefferson's time in office? It's definitely going to be the famous Louisiana Purchase. When you think of this, you want to be thinking of France controls it. Napoleon basically is going to be in charge, and you're also going to have to purchase it. And we'll look at the implications in a second. Now, this is where it gets to be really interesting, and this is the constitutional argument that almost always comes up with Jefferson. Because remember, he was not really in favor of that expansive interpretation of our Constitution. Okay, was the purchase of Louisiana Territory, or purchase territory, if you want to call it that, constitutional? Well, here's kind of like the tough side. Nothing in the Constitution formally says that the president or whoever it is has the authority to purchase land like this. Okay, but we do have a part of our Constitution that is what we call the necessary and proper clause. Now, if you're kind of wondering what's the difference, we're not going to get into all this, but you've got delegated powers that are very specific in Article 1, Section 8. Congress has the power, as you can see here, Article Section 8, Paragraph 7. You don't have to worry about memorizing all the paragraphs. But just an example, guys, of delegated, which is specific, is they had the power to establish post offices and post roads. That is specific, all right? And you could say, was there a little bit of interpretation there about how long they can be or whatever? Maybe. But at the end of the day, that is a specific power that Congress has the right to do. Now, implied is where we get into the doctrine of necessary and proper, right? Which, as you can imagine, some people weren't really on board with that because of how much power it could give to the federal government, in this case, the Congress, okay? Some people were very leery of congressional power, okay? But anyway, something to keep in the back of your minds. But this is what it says in Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 18, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the U.S. or in any department or officer thereof. Now, we'll come back to that, but just something to think about. It's not specific. It doesn't say road. It doesn't say you have the power to tax. You have the power to invest in scientific achievement or whatever. Okay. It basically says that you have kind of like, in a sense, the power to interpret it based on necessary and proper. Now, Alexander Hamilton was a big advocate of this, and he had to defend necessary and proper and how it wasn't going to be a detriment to our, government and all that. And one of the arguments that Hamilton makes is, this is going to help us to basically carry out some of the powers that are formally given to Congress, like the one that you see above. Okay. And so what we notice, guys, is that Jefferson is going to have a big decision to make. My question to all of you is buying all this land that you see in the green there, would you consider that to be necessary and proper? Now, in order to understand a little bit more, think about where the boundary of the United States is prior to, the western boundary, I should say, prior to all this territory. And it's basically going to be, as you can see here, for the most part, the Mississippi River. Is it a good thing that we always have to go to the French or the Spanish or whoever it might be to say to them and negotiate treaties? Which, by the way, guys, you got to remember, there's no airplanes back then. So it's not just you're hopping on a plane, flying across the ocean 6 hours, and you know what, you're landing, right? In other words, wheels on the ground, and you're automatically there to start talking. Doesn't work that way, okay? Which makes this process even more difficult back then, which is why we can respect the fact that this process really is remarkable that they got it done, okay? But the original intention was, if we want to be able to control the Mississippi River, then we have to be able to control the port city of New Orleans, as of course they would say down there. Now, who controls New Orleans and all this territory? The French do. So think about that. Why would they want to give up, all this territory? Well, who's in power in France at this period of time? Napoleon, right? In other words, a guy who has been at war for many years and is still at war and will be at war until around 1812, 1815. Okay? The other thing we got to consider, guys, is that the French colony of Haiti, which is in the Caribbean in the early 1800s, 1801 I think it was, has actually declared their former independence. Now they're independent. So France is gradually losing this empire in the New World. And so the question might be, okay, if we don't accept this amount, this money for New Orleans, then you know what? We're going to basically lose the empire anyway. So Robert Livingston, you don't have to worry about his name, but it's kind of an important thing to at least keep in your mind. So a diplomat goes over there and he has one basic thing in mind, one order, if you will. And the order is to basically offer $10 million to purchase only the port city of New Orleans. Well, guess what happens? The French give him an even better offer. $15 million. You get all of this land, which I think was something like 3 cents or 33 cents an acre or something like that. So in other words, very cheap. A lot of historians call this the greatest real estate purchase in American history. So it sounds really good. The question is it necessary and proper? And Jefferson kind of, I guess, struggles with this to an extent because technically he's been arguing against this doctrine for years and years. And then, another thing is that, okay, how do we pay for it? Well, we're going to have to go back to that Bank of the United States, which, oh yeah, by the way, for 15 plus years, I've been telling the Hamiltonians and the Federalists, this is the worst thing in the world. He's got to kind of consider those things, right? So I'll leave it up to you. Is he hypocritical? Is he kind of, not exactly consistent? But is it necessary and proper? Well, we know eventually what happens. The purchase is made. We don't know all the things that the purchase can do. And this is where we'll end, guys, the next couple of things. But that's where Lewis and Clark come into the picture. Which, oh yeah, by the way, last time I checked, I don't think, if I'm not mistaken, that Jefferson gets congressional approval with all these Lewis and Clark expeditions. But nonetheless, he's like, well, we got to figure out what this land is about, resources. We say resources, that could be the kind of animals that are there, the kind of things along the lines of like natural resources, and what happens is Lewis and Clark, as you can see, guys, make a series of ventures. Now, I'm going to put a little website as a supplemental activity that I'll show you the website here as we transition to that you can go through and you can look at a lot of their different findings and things. It's pretty cool. It's not really in game form like the George Washington game from last week, but it at least gives you an idea about like things that you can look up. Like they kept very, very detailed journals. I think it was one of them. I want to say it was Lewis, but it may have been Clark. Anyway, one of them I think is like a little gift for Jefferson. He brought back like 2 bear cubs or something like that, right? As kind of like a gift or whatever it was. Okay, so they're going to come across a lot of things. And what you'll find, guys, moving forward is that a lot of these trails that they paved are literally later on, in many cases, going to become roads, but they're going to become trails that will lead out west, right? So you're going to have like the Oregon Trail, you're going to have like the Santa Fe Trail down in New Mexico, you're going to have the Mormon Trail eventually. That's obviously going to take Mormons and other people eventually out to Utah. And so there's a lot of things that you find to be pretty important, right? What kind of resources do they find? Quite a few. Gold, silver, iron ore, things that really make a strong mark on the American economy, especially moving into the latter 1800s when you're looking at like the additional rise of mining and big business and things like that. So here's my point. This is 1804. This is his first term coming to a close. This looks pretty good, man. Your first term's been awesome. Well, second term, it's going to have its share of complications. And this is the tip of the iceberg, but guys, keep in mind, America is still having a lot of problems at sea. We had issues with the Barbary pirates in Northern Africa. We also have issues with Europe. They're at war still, the British and the French and other countries too. And they're harassing us at sea. They're impressing our soldiers. We'll look at what that means more next week. They're basically taking, especially the British were big on this too, taking them off of our ships, putting them on their ships, kind of forcing them into a degree of military service. Jefferson and the Congress have to decide, what do we do? This is not a new issue, by the way. I mean, the impressment goes all the way back to even pre-revolution, in other words, like 1760s and before, okay? So this is not a new issue, but you fast forward the clock to the early 1800s, and it's not been adequately resolved. Treaties like Jay's Treaty in the 1790s under Washington does not adequately address or resolve the issue of impressment. So what does the Jefferson administration with Congress's support do? The Congress passes the Embargo Act, and Jefferson basically agrees to it. What does the embargo do? It basically cut off all international trade with pretty much not just France, not just Britain, but the entire world community. Even our backyard, if you're looking at countries that are, becoming independent in South America, etc. Okay, or that will. So if you're an American merchant, you're not happy about this. That becomes a big deal during the War of 1812. This is an unpopular act. Jefferson takes a lot of heat for this. and he leaves the presidency. Guys, if you ever look at pictures of Jefferson from start to finish, and this is not just unique to him, he ages considerably. I read a thing that said he had massive migraine headaches, a lot of health problems. He lives until 1826. So, when he is basically going to pass away, what is on his tombstone? Well, the Declaration of Independence is on there. Another thing that's on there, for those of you that like university facts, is that after he leaves office, he's very committed to the idea of a public university in his home state of Virginia, which becomes the UVA campus, which we call University of Virginia. He's very committed to doing that, and he does. One of the things anyway, that he does not put on his gravestone, the presidency. And a lot of historians, guys, come to the conclusion that he hated the presidency so much that he doesn't even want to have anything to do with it moving forward. This act does not prove well, or at least the effects of it, with his good friend James Madison taking office in 1809. I'm going to share with you my screen really quick before we look at what you need to do for tonight. All right, this is lesson 2, keep in mind. Okay, so I was telling you a little bit, guys, about the website. This is Mr. Nussbaum. If you take a look here, guys, you'll notice I'm going to post this as a supplemental assignment. It's got a lot of really cool things, like you can go through, introduce. You've got like a little food for thought things. This is, I think, a little bit more designed for probably middle school, but even high school students might find it to be pretty cool. And then you'll notice, guys, as you look at all these different parts, you notice about how these ventures or expeditions start to interact with different things. You can see biographies of the 2 explorers. Sacagawea, who's a famous, of course, Native American that was very helpful to them moving forward, translating English back to her native language and vice versa, and then so forth. So if this is something you want to take a few minutes of your time to look at, might be a good idea to, but I am going to sign off really quick. Your last thing is to finish up one really important thing, and that is your submissions for the rest of the week. Please make sure that you've submitted assignment 1. Remember, late work policy, if it's not submitted by midnight of that night, then it will be the 80 the next day and the 50 the following day. Guys, I get it. Communication over a lot of technology glitches. Please make sure you're doing that. It's a lot easier to work with you before rather than after. All right. So please do that. Second thing is that for standard, you have a weekly review activity. You'll have the vocab that you'll be reviewing, the 5 terms or whatever number it is. And then you'll also have 5 multiple choice. Remember, this is kind of seen as seeing how you've connected the readings and also the class discussions for the week. You can take that as many times as you want. The 50 out of 50 is the highest grade. If I'm all of you, which I'm not, but my opinion dime might get you a cup of coffee on a good day at Starbucks, but it'll probably help you in this class better. I would definitely encourage you all to do it maybe 2 or 3 times. Why? Because you're getting to see different questions, especially with the multiple choice, that's helping to prepare you for the third thing, which is our weekly assessment. Okay, we'll have office hours from 9 to 10 for standard on Friday and from 10 to 11 for honors. So we'll go over any questions that you have about content, readings, quiz questions. If you take the quiz the first time, you have some things to ask about, we can do that. And then also our skills focus, which will also be the 3rd video under the week videos that you have access to. This is Mr. Baker signing out. Hope you all had a great time. Hope you all enjoyed our very brief yet important study of the Jefferson administration as presidency. And feel free to email me if you have any questions. Thank you so much and have a good one.